The sound of my coffee cup hitting the saucer echoed through the silence that followed my daughter's words. "We're adults now, Mom. We don't need you anymore." Rebecca's voice was matter-of-fact, almost clinical, as if she were discussing the weather rather than dismantling 30 years of motherhood in a single sentence. My son Daniel nodded in agreement from across the table at our usual Sunday brunch spot, his expensive suit pristine as always. "What Rebecca means is that we've established our own lives. We have our careers, our own families. It's time for you to step back and let us be independent." I smiled calmly, reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. 3 taps later, I was staring at my will document, and with 4 more taps, I had deleted their names entirely. "Well then," I said, my voice steady as granite, "I suppose you won't be needing this inheritance either. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The shocked expressions on my children's faces were almost worth the 28 years of single motherhood that had led to this moment. Rebecca's perfectly contoured face went pale beneath her makeup, and Daniel's confident smirk disappeared faster than ice cream on hot pavement. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I ended up in this upscale cafe, calmly rewriting my will while my ungrateful children watched in horror. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 56, I thought I had figured out what unconditional love meant. I had been wrong about a lot of things, but that particular misconception was about to cost my children everything they thought they were entitled to. The journey to this moment started 3 decades ago when my husband David died in a car accident, leaving me with 2 toddlers and a mountain of debt that seemed impossible to climb. I was 26 years old, working as a receptionist at a small accounting firm, when the world collapsed around me. Rebecca was 4, Daniel was 2, and I had exactly $347 in our checking account when the funeral expenses were paid. The life insurance policy that David had promised to update after the children were born was still listing his mother as the beneficiary, and she made it crystal clear that she had no intention of sharing a single penny with the woman she blamed for her son's death. Those early years were a blur of double shifts, community college classes at night, and falling asleep over textbooks while the children slept. I worked my way up from receptionist to bookkeeper to junior accountant, taking every certification course I could afford, and some I couldn't. The children learned to be self-sufficient early, making their own breakfast while I studied for the CPA exam, doing homework at the kitchen table while I prepared tax returns for neighbors to earn extra money. I never remarried, despite several opportunities. There was Marcus, the kind pediatrician who treated the children when they had the flu. He asked me out repeatedly, but I was too focused on building our future to risk the stability we had barely achieved. There was James, the divorced father I met at Rebecca's school, who understood the challenges of single parenthood. We dated for 6 months before I realized that adding another person to our carefully balanced life would only complicate things for the children. Every decision I made was filtered through a single question: what was best for Rebecca and Daniel? When I finally got my CPA license and was offered a position at a prestigious firm downtown, I took it despite the longer commute, because the salary would mean better schools for the children. When I had the opportunity to buy a small duplex in an up-and-coming neighborhood, I stretched our budget to the breaking point, because I wanted them to have stability and a good address. The duplex turned out to be one of the smartest investments I ever made. I rented out the other half to help with the mortgage, and as the neighborhood gentrified over the years, the property value tripled. But the children never saw it as anything more than the place they grew up, taking for granted the sacrifices that made it possible. Rebecca was always the dramatic one. Even as a child, she had dreams of becoming an actress, then a fashion designer, then a social media influencer, before finally settling on marketing for a luxury goods company. She was beautiful, confident, and had inherited her father's charm along with my stubborn determination. The problem was that she had also inherited a sense of entitlement that I had accidentally fostered by always putting her needs first. Daniel was quieter but equally ambitious. He excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and science, and I was so proud when he was accepted to an expensive private university with a partial scholarship. I took out loans to cover the rest, working overtime to pay for his living expenses while he focused on his studies. He graduated with honors and immediately landed a position at a tech startup that eventually went public, making him quite wealthy at the young age of 28. Both children had successful careers, beautiful homes, and lifestyles that far exceeded anything I had ever imagined for myself. Rebecca lived in a downtown loft that cost more per month than I had made in 6 months during those early years. Daniel owned a suburban mansion with a 3-car garage and a pool that he used maybe twice a year. They had both achieved the American dream, and I was incredibly proud of what they had accomplished. The problem was that somewhere along the way, they had forgotten who had made their success possible. The sacrifices I had made became invisible to them, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. The woman who had worked 70-hour weeks to pay for their college education became just mom, someone who existed in the background of their important lives, available when needed but otherwise irrelevant. The shift had been gradual, so subtle that I didn't notice it at first. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Holiday visits felt more like obligations than celebrations. When Rebecca got married 3 years ago, I offered to help with the wedding expenses, remembering how I had dreamed of giving her the perfect wedding when she was little. She accepted my check for $15,000 with barely a thank you, then spent the entire reception apologizing to her new in-laws for the modest venue and simple decorations. Daniel's wedding 2 years later was even more painful. He and his fiancée Jennifer planned an elaborate destination wedding in Tuscany, assuming that I couldn't afford to attend. When I surprised them by booking my flight and arranging time off work, Jennifer made passive-aggressive comments about how I would need to be careful about my wardrobe choices because the other guests were very fashion-conscious. I spent more on a single dress for that wedding than I had spent on clothes for myself in the previous 2 years, determined not to embarrass my son. The breaking point came 6 months ago when Daniel and Jennifer announced they were expecting their first child. I was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a grandmother and immediately offered to help with childcare, knowing how expensive daycare could be. Jennifer's response was a polite but firm explanation that they would be hiring a professional nanny because they needed someone qualified to care for their child. When I pressed gently, suggesting that I had successfully raised 2 children of my own, Rebecca jumped in to support her sister-in-law. "Mom, no offense, but childcare has changed a lot since we were kids. Jennifer and Daniel want someone with actual training and certifications." The implication was clear. My experience as their mother was worthless, outdated, insufficient for their precious offspring. That conversation replayed in my mind for weeks afterward. I began to notice other small slights, comments that I had previously dismissed as thoughtless but now recognized as systematic dismissal of my value in their lives. When I mentioned,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Feeling tired after a particularly busy tax season, Rebecca suggested I should consider slowing down and maybe think about retirement. When I expressed interest in traveling to Europe, something I had dreamed of for years but never been able to afford, Daniel questioned whether I should be spending money on frivolous things at my age. The irony was that they had no idea how much money I actually had. While they were building their careers and lifestyles, I had continued living modestly in my paid-off duplex, investing every spare dollar in a diversified portfolio that had grown steadily over the years. The accounting firm where I worked had been acquired by a larger corporation 5 years ago, and my shares in the company had been converted to a substantial payout that I had quietly reinvested. Between the real estate investments, the stock portfolio, and my retirement accounts, I was worth just over $4.7 million. Not bad for a single mother who had started with $347 and a mountain of debt. But my children saw only what they expected to see: a middle-aged woman living in the same modest duplex she had owned for 20 years, driving a sensible but unremarkable car, wearing clothes from department stores instead of designer boutiques. Their assumptions about my financial situation led to increasingly condescending conversations about my future. Rebecca suggested I might want to consider moving to a senior living community before I got too old to make the transition easily. Daniel recommended I meet with a financial planner to make sure I would have enough money to last through retirement. Both of them spoke to me like I was a child who couldn't be trusted to make important decisions about my own life. The final straw came 3 weeks ago when Daniel called to inform me that he and Rebecca had been discussing my situation and had decided it would be best if I gave them power of attorney over my financial affairs. "It's just a precaution, Mom. he explained in the same tone he might use to explain something to a confused elderly person. "We want to make sure you're protected from scams and bad decisions. You know how these things can happen to people your age." I was so stunned by the audacity of the suggestion that I couldn't find words to respond. My children, who had never shown the slightest interest in my financial well-being beyond what I could contribute to their own lives, wanted legal control over my money because they assumed I was too incompetent to manage it myself. When I declined their generous offer, Rebecca became visibly frustrated. "Mom, you're being stubborn," she said during our next phone conversation. "We're only trying to help. You can't expect to handle these things on your own forever." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in manipulation, disguised as concern. They painted a picture of a lonely, confused woman making poor decisions while her loving children watched helplessly from the sidelines. That brought us to this morning's brunch, which I now realized had been planned as an intervention of sorts. Rebecca and Daniel had coordinated their schedules to meet me at Café Meridian, an upscale establishment in the downtown area where Rebecca worked. The choice of venue was deliberate, I understood now. They wanted to have this conversation in a place where I would feel out of my element, where the expensive menu and elegant decor would remind me of the gulf between their lifestyle and mine. They had ordered confidently, Rebecca choosing the organic salmon Benedict and Daniel selecting the artisanal breakfast pizza, while I had opted for simple scrambled eggs and toast. Even their food choices were a statement about the differences between us, I realized. They belonged in places like this. I was just visiting. The conversation had started innocuously enough, with updates about their work and social lives. Rebecca mentioned a promotion she was expecting, and Daniel described a vacation he and Jennifer were planning to take after the baby was born. I listened and asked appropriate questions, playing the role of the interested mother, but I could sense an undercurrent of tension that suggested this was not just a casual family meal. The shift came when I mentioned that I was thinking about taking a cruise to Alaska, something I had been researching online. It was a modest trip, nothing extravagant, but something I had always wanted to do. The silence that followed my announcement was telling. Rebecca and Daniel exchanged a look that spoke volumes about their opinion of my travel plans. "Mom," Rebecca said carefully, "are you sure that's the best use of your money right now? I mean, shouldn't you be focusing on securing your future instead of spending on things like cruises?" Her tone was gentle but condescending, like a parent explaining to a child why they couldn't have candy before dinner. Daniel nodded in agreement. "Rebecca's right. At your age, every dollar counts. You should be thinking about healthcare costs, inflation, the possibility that you might need assisted living someday. A cruise is a luxury you probably can't afford." The assumption that I couldn't afford a simple cruise after 30 years of careful financial planning was insulting enough, but what really stung was the implication that I was too irresponsible to make appropriate decisions about my own money. These were the same children I had put through college, whose weddings I had helped fund, whose success had been built on the foundation of my sacrifices. "I appreciate your concern," I said, keeping my voice level, "but I think I can manage my own finances." That's when Rebecca dropped the bomb that had been building throughout the conversation. "Mom, we need to talk about something important," she said, leaning forward with the expression of someone about to deliver difficult news. "Daniel and I have been talking, and we think it's time for you to accept that things have changed. We're adults now with our own responsibilities. We don't need you to take care of us anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. After 30 years of defining myself primarily as their mother, of making every major decision based on what was best for them, I was being told that my services were no longer required. Daniel picked up where Rebecca left off, his tone businesslike and efficient. "What Rebecca means is that we've established our own lives. We have our careers, our own families. It's time for you to step back and let us be independent." He might as well have been delivering a corporate restructuring announcement. "We don't expect you to keep helping us financially or otherwise. We're capable of taking care of ourselves." The irony was breathtaking. These were the same children who had accepted my help with their college expenses, their wedding costs, their down payments on their first homes. They had never once suggested that my assistance was unwanted or unnecessary when they were the ones benefiting from it. But now that they were established and successful, my continued presence in their lives had become an inconvenience rather than a blessing. "We think it would be best for everyone if you focused on your own life for a change," Rebecca continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a prepared speech. You've spent so many years taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's time to think about what you want for yourself. The suggestion that I should focus on my own life was rich, coming from the daughter who had spent the last 10 minutes explaining why a simple cruise was beyond my means. What they really meant was that I should focus on my own life, as long as it didn't interfere with theirs, didn't require their attention or involvement, and didn't challenge their assumptions about who I was supposed to be. You're saying you don't need me anymore, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. We're saying we're adults now, Mom, Daniel replied. We don't need you to take care of us anymore. That's when I reached for my phone and opened the banking app that connected to my investment account. I had been managing my own portfolio for years, making decisions that had multiplied my modest savings into a substantial fortune. As I looked at the numbers on the screen, I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me. These children, who thought I was too incompetent to afford a cruise, who wanted legal control over my finances, who had just informed me that my role in their lives was no longer needed, had no idea that they were about to inherit several $1,000,000 when I died. The will I had written 5 years ago left everything to them in equal shares, with small bequests to a few charities I supported. But if they no longer needed me, if my presence in their lives had become an unwelcome burden, then perhaps they no longer needed my money either. I opened the digital copy of my will that I kept on my phone, the document I had been meaning to update after Daniel's marriage but had never gotten around to changing. The will was surprisingly easy to modify using the legal app I had downloaded months ago. A few taps to delete their names as beneficiaries, a few more to designate new recipients for my estate. I had always been impressed by modern technology, and the ability to completely rewrite my will while sitting in a cafe seemed like a perfect metaphor for the new chapter I was apparently starting in my life. Well then, I said, looking up from my phone to meet their confused stares. I suppose you won't be needing this inheritance either. The transformation in their expressions was immediate and dramatic. Rebecca's face went from confident to confused to horrified in the span of about 3 seconds. Daniel's mouth actually fell open, giving him an expression I hadn't seen since he was 8 years old and had broken my favorite vase while playing baseball in the house. What inheritance? Rebecca asked, her voice suddenly small and uncertain. I turned my phone screen toward them, showing the portfolio balance that had been growing steadily for 30 years. $4.7 million, give or take a few thousand depending on the market's performance that day. The number seemed to glow on the screen, hypnotic in its significance. What is that? Daniel whispered, leaning forward to get a better look at the display. That, I said calmly, is what you won't be inheriting. I swiped to the will document, showing them the changes I had just made. Where their names had been listed as equal beneficiaries, there were now several charitable organizations dedicated to helping single mothers and their children. The silence that followed was deafening. Around us, the cafe continued its normal Sunday rhythm, with other families enjoying leisurely brunches and friends catching up over coffee. But at our table, the world had stopped spinning. Rebecca and Daniel stared at my phone screen like it was displaying information in a foreign language they couldn't understand. You have almost $5 million? Rebecca finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. I do, I replied, putting my phone back in my purse with deliberate calm. Or rather, I did. But since you're adults who don't need me anymore, I thought it made sense to find people who might appreciate what I have to offer. Daniel was still processing the information, his engineer's mind trying to calculate how the woman he thought was living paycheck to paycheck had accumulated such wealth. How did you get this money? When did this happen? I've been building this portfolio for 30 years, I explained, enjoying their shock more than I probably should have. Every bonus, every tax refund, every dollar I could spare went into investments. While you were growing up, I was growing my net worth. While you were building your careers, I was building my retirement fund. The implications were sinking in now, and I could see the wheels turning in their heads. Rebecca was calculating how much money she had just lost with her casual dismissal of my relevance. Daniel was trying to figure out how he had so completely misjudged his mother's financial situation. But you live in that same old duplex, Rebecca said as if my choice of housing somehow invalidated the numbers they had just seen. You drive that old car, Shop at normal stores. I live within my means, I corrected her. There's a difference between being poor and being practical. I learned a long time ago that real wealth isn't about showing off how much money you have. It's about having the freedom to make choices based on what you want rather than what you can afford. Like the choice to disinherit your children? Daniel asked, his voice carrying a note of accusation that I found particularly rich given the conversation that had preceded this revelation. Like the choice to support people who value my contribution to their lives, I replied evenly. These organizations help single mothers get education and job training, provide childcare assistance, and offer financial literacy programs. They understand the value of help when it's offered. Rebecca was frantically trying to backtrack now, her marketing training kicking in as she attempted to salvage the situation. Mom, I think there's been a misunderstanding. When we said we didn't need you, we didn't mean we didn't want you in our lives. We just meant that we're independent now. Independent enough to suggest I give you power of attorney over my finances? I asked. Independent enough to question my decision to take a cruise? Independent enough to tell me that my childcare experience isn't adequate for your children? The color drained from Daniel's face as he realized I had been paying attention to all the small dismissals and condescending comments over the past few months. We were just trying to look out for you, he said weakly. No, I said, standing up and placing enough cash on the table to cover my portion of the bill plus a generous tip. You were trying to control me. There's a significant difference. I picked up my purse and looked down at my children, these successful adults who had just learned that their assumptions about their aging mother were completely wrong. Enjoy your breakfast, I said pleasantly. And enjoy your independence. I'm gonna go book that Alaska cruise. As I walked toward the exit, I could hear them calling my name, but I didn't turn around. For the first time in 30 years, I was walking away from my children not because I didn't love them, but because I finally loved myself enough to demand better treatment. The spring air outside the cafe felt fresh and full of possibilities. I had just rewritten my entire future in the space of a 10-minute conversation, and instead of feeling regret or sadness, I felt lighter than I had in years. My phone was already buzzing with calls from Rebecca and Daniel, but I ignored them as I walked to my car. The drive home gave me time to think about what I had just done and what it meant for the rest of my life. I had spent 3 decades defining myself through my relationship to my children, measuring my success by their achievements, finding my purpose in their happiness, but they had just made it clear that my services in those roles were no longer required. Fine, if they wanted independence, they could have it completely. And I could finally have the freedom to discover who Margaret Chen was when she wasn't primarily somebody's mother. The cottage that waited for me was exactly the same as it had been when I left that morning, but everything felt different. The modest rooms that Rebecca found embarrassing suddenly seemed cozy and perfectly suited to my needs. The sensible furniture that Daniel dismissed as outdated was comfortable and paid for. The small garden that neither of them ever noticed was a source of pride and peace that cost nothing, but brought me daily joy. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop, pulling up the cruise websites I had been browsing earlier. The Alaska trip I had mentioned was just the beginning. There were river cruises through Europe, photo safaris in Africa, cultural tours through Asia. For the first time in my adult life, I could afford to do whatever I wanted without worrying about the cost or asking anyone's permission. But first, I had a will to finalize properly. The changes I had made on my phone were legally binding, but I wanted to visit my attorney and make sure everything was documented correctly. I also wanted to research the charities I had chosen as beneficiaries, to make sure my money would go to organizations that truly made a difference in the lives of single mothers and their children. My phone continued to ring throughout the afternoon. Rebecca called 6 times, and Daniel called 4 times. I let every call go to voicemail, not because I was angry, but because I needed time to process what had happened and decide how I wanted to move forward. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. This was about finally putting myself first after 30 years of putting everyone else ahead of my own needs and desires. The voicemails they left were predictable. Rebecca's messages started with confusion and escalated to panic as she realized I wasn't going to answer, Daniel's were more measured, but I could hear the underlying desperation as he tried to find the right words to undo what had been said. Both of them wanted to meet, to talk, to explain what they had really meant. But I had heard exactly what they meant. After years of small slights and casual dismissals, they had finally been honest about how they saw me, as an aging woman whose usefulness had expired, whose advice was outdated, whose presence was more burden than blessing. The money I had accumulated didn't change who I was, but it did change what I was willing to accept from people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. As the sun set over my small garden, I realized that this day had been a long time coming. The signs had been there for years, but I had been too invested in my role as their mother to see clearly. Now that the illusion was shattered, I could finally see the relationship for what it had become, a one-sided arrangement where I provided financial and emotional support while receiving criticism and condescension in return. Tomorrow I would start the process of reclaiming my life. I would book that Alaska cruise, and maybe the European river cruise after that. I would redecorate my cottage in colors that made me happy, instead of neutral tones that offended no one. I would join clubs and take classes, and meet people who were interested in who I was now, not what I could do for them. And maybe, eventually, Rebecca and Daniel would learn to see me as a whole person, instead of just their mother. Maybe they would develop enough respect for the woman who had raised them to rebuild our relationship on equal terms. Maybe they would understand that love without respect is just manipulation disguised as family obligation. Or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they would continue to see me as an ungrateful mother who had chosen strangers over her own children. Maybe they would never understand that their inheritance was never an entitlement, but a gift that could be withdrawn when the recipients demonstrated that they didn't value the giver. Either way, I was finally free to find out who I was when I wasn't trying to earn love that should have been freely given. And that freedom, I was beginning to realize, was worth more than any inheritance I could have left them. The Alaska cruise brochure arrived in my mailbox 3 days after I had walked out of Cafe Meridian, its glossy images of glaciers and wildlife, serving as a tangible reminder that my new life was already beginning. I spread the colorful pages across my kitchen table, studying the itinerary with the same careful attention I had once devoted to my children's school schedules and extracurricular activities. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was finally planning something purely for my own enjoyment. My phone had been remarkably quiet since Tuesday morning. After the initial barrage of calls and increasingly frantic voicemails, Rebecca and Daniel had apparently decided to give me space to cool down, as if my decision to rewrite my will was merely an emotional reaction that would fade with time. They couldn't have been more wrong. Every day that passed without contact from them only reinforced my conviction that I had made the right choice. Wednesday brought an unexpected visitor. I was in my garden, transplanting the tomato seedlings I had started indoors, when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the lattice fence that separated my small yard from the front of the house, I could see Jennifer's sleek silver sedan. My daughter-in-law emerged from the driver's seat wearing one of her impeccably tailored maternity dresses, her growing belly prominently displayed beneath the expensive fabric. I considered pretending I wasn't home, but Jennifer had already spotted me through the fence. "Margaret," she called out in her carefully modulated voice, the one she used when she wanted something but was trying to sound casual about it. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I was in the neighborhood and thought we could chat." Jennifer had never been in my neighborhood for any reason other than obligatory family visits, and she had certainly never initiated a casual chat with me. Her presence here could only mean one thing: Daniel had sent her to attempt damage control. I wiped the soil from my hands and walked to the front gate, curious to see what approach she would take. "What can I do for you, Jennifer?" I asked, not bothering to invite her inside. The message was clear. This was not a social visit, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She smiled that practiced smile I had seen her use with difficult clients and unreasonable vendors. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened with Daniel and Rebecca on Sunday. I think there might have been some miscommunication." Miscommunication? As if the problem was that I had misunderstood their clear statement that they no longer needed me in their lives. "I don't think there was any miscommunication at all," I replied evenly. "They were quite clear about their feelings." Jennifer's smile faltered slightly, But she pressed on with the determination of someone who was used to getting her way through persistence and charm. Daniel feels terrible about how things were said. He never meant to hurt your feelings. He's worried that you might have taken things the wrong way. The wrong way. Another phrase designed to make me question my own perception of reality. And what would be the right way to take being told that my presence in their lives is no longer needed? He didn't mean it like that, Jennifer said quickly. He meant that you don't need to worry about taking care of us anymore, that you can focus on yourself for a change. It was supposed to be liberating, not hurtful. I almost laughed at the absurdity of her explanation. Daniel had sent his pregnant wife to convince me that being dismissed by my own children was actually a gift. How thoughtful of him to liberate me from the burden of loving my children, I said with deliberate sweetness. Jennifer's composure cracked just enough for me to see the frustration underneath. This conversation wasn't going according to whatever script she had prepared. Margaret, I think you're being a little unfair. Daniel loves you, we all do. This is just a misunderstanding that's gotten blown out of proportion. Is it? I asked. Then perhaps you can explain why your husband thought I needed his permission to take a cruise. Or why he assumed I couldn't afford to travel. Or why both of my children wanted legal control over my finances because they were concerned about my decision-making abilities. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Jennifer was clearly aware of these conversations, which meant Daniel had been discussing my supposed incompetence with his wife. They had been analyzing my life and finding it wanting, making plans for my future without bothering to consult me. Look, Jennifer said, abandoning her diplomatic approach for something more direct. I don't know anything about your financial situation, and frankly, it's not my business. But I do know that Daniel is upset about whatever happened to your will. He mentioned that you made some changes. There it was. The real reason for her visit. Daniel was upset about the changes to my will, which meant he had known or assumed he was inheriting money from me. The son who thought I couldn't afford a simple cruise had apparently been counting on his inheritance. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. My will is my business, I said firmly. Just like my finances and my travel plans and every other aspect of my life that your husband seems to think requires his oversight. Jennifer's professional mask was slipping now, revealing the calculating woman underneath. Don't you think you're being a little hasty? Making major financial decisions when you're upset isn't usually wise. Maybe you should take some time to think about this before you do something you'll regret. The condescension in her voice was unmistakable. Even my daughter-in-law, who had known me for less than 5 years, felt qualified to question my judgment and suggest that my decisions were emotionally driven rather than rational. The pattern was clear. Everyone in my family had been discussing my supposed shortcomings and limitations behind my back. I've had 30 years to think about this, I replied. 30 years of putting my children's needs ahead of my own. 30 years of accepting criticism disguised as concern. 30 years of being treated like an inconvenience rather than a blessing. I'm not upset, Jennifer. I'm clear-minded for the first time in decades. She tried one more approach, the one that women like her always fell back on when logic and manipulation failed. What about the baby? She asked, placing a protective hand over her belly. Don't you want to be part of your grandchild's life? This kind of family drama isn't good for anyone, especially not for children. The irony of her concern for family drama was rich, considering that she had been the one to suggest my childcare experience was inadequate for their precious baby. But the mention of my future grandchild did give me pause. I had been looking forward to being a grandmother, to having the opportunity to build a relationship with this new generation that might appreciate my presence in their lives. I would love to be part of my grandchild's life, I said carefully. But that depends entirely on whether their parents want me involved. Based on recent conversations, it seems like you and Daniel prefer professional caregivers to family members. Jennifer's face flushed with embarrassment, as she realized I was referring to her dismissal of my offer to help with childcare. That's not what I meant, she said weakly. We just thought that with your age and everything. My age and everything, I repeated. You mean my incompetence and outdated methods. The same incompetence that raised the man you married. I stepped back toward my front door, signaling that this conversation was over. Give Daniel my regards, Jennifer, and tell him that if he wants to discuss our relationship, he can call me himself instead of sending his wife to clean up his mistakes. After Jennifer left, I sat in my living room for a long time, thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about my family's perception of me. They saw me as an aging woman whose judgment couldn't be trusted, whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, whose value was measured entirely by what I could provide for them. The money I had accumulated didn't change their fundamental view of me. It just made them more interested in managing my decline. That evening, I called my attorney, Sarah Morrison, to schedule an appointment. Sarah had been handling my legal affairs for over a decade, and she had always treated me with the respect and professionalism that my own family seemed incapable of showing. When I explained that I wanted to formalize the changes I had made to my will, she didn't question my decision-making ability or suggest that I might be acting emotionally. "I'll need to review the charitable organizations you've chosen as beneficiaries," she said practically. "We want to make sure they're properly structured to receive this type of bequest. Have you considered establishing a foundation instead of direct bequests?" The suggestion intrigued me. A foundation would allow me to maintain some control over how my money was used, even after my death. I could specify that the funds be used for educational scholarships, job, training programs, and childcare assistance for single mothers. It would be a lasting legacy that reflected my values, rather than simply enriching people who had demonstrated that they didn't value my contributions to their lives. "I'd like to explore that option," I told Sarah. "I want to make sure the money goes to people who will appreciate it and use it wisely." "Of course," she replied. "Why don't you come in Friday afternoon, and we can discuss the details. I'll have my staff research foundation structures and tax implications in the meantime." After I hung up with Sarah, I felt a sense of purpose that I hadn't experienced in years. Instead of simply reacting to my children's dismissal, I was taking proactive steps to create something meaningful with my life's work. The money I had saved through decades of sacrifice would help other women avoid the struggles I had faced as a young single mother. Thursday brought another unexpected development. Rebecca appeared at my door around noon, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. My daughter had always been confident to the point of arrogance, but today she seemed almost nervous as she stood on my front porch. "Mom, can we talk?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "I know you're angry, but I think we need to clear the air." I studied her face, looking for signs of genuine remorse or understanding. What I saw instead was calculation. Rebecca was here because she wanted something, not because she had experienced any real change of heart. But I was curious to hear what approach she would take, so I invited her inside. She settled onto my sofa with the careful grace she had learned in her expensive finishing school, the one I had scrimped and saved to send her to because she had insisted it was essential for her future success. Everything about her posture and expression was designed to convey sincerity, but I had watched her practice these techniques since she was a teenager, learning to manipulate her way out of trouble. "I've been thinking about our conversation on Sunday," she began, "and I realized that some of the things we said might have come across wrong. We never meant to hurt you or make you feel unwanted." Come across wrong. Another phrase designed to make me question my interpretation of clear statements. "How did you mean for them to come across?" I asked. Rebecca paused, clearly trying to find the right words to reframe their dismissal as something benevolent. "We meant that you don't have to feel responsible for us anymore, that you can finally live your own life without worrying about taking care of everyone else." "I see," I said neutrally. "And did it occur to either of you to ask whether I wanted to stop being involved in your lives? Or did you simply assume that motherhood was a burden I was eager to shed?" She shifted uncomfortably, realizing that her explanation wasn't having the desired effect. "Of course we want you involved. We just meant that you don't have to sacrifice your own happiness for ours anymore." The word sacrifice hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken history. Rebecca was acknowledging, perhaps for the first time, that I had given up things for her benefit. But even this admission was couched in terms that suggested my sacrifices had been unnecessary, a product of my own poor judgment rather than acts of love. "What sacrifices do you think I've made?" I asked, genuinely curious to see how much of our history she actually understood. Rebecca looked surprised by the question, as if she had expected me to accept her explanation and move on to forgiveness. Well, you never remarried. You could have had companionship, someone to share your life with. I chose not to remarry, I corrected her, because I wanted to focus on raising you and Daniel properly. Every man I dated understood that you two came first. But that was your choice, she said quickly. We never asked you to stay single. The statement revealed so much about how she viewed our relationship. In Rebecca's mind, my choices had been mine alone, unconnected to her needs or Daniel's welfare. She couldn't see that a mother's decisions are always made in the context of what's best for her children, even when those children are too young to understand the implications. You're right, I agreed. It was my choice. Just like choosing to work overtime to pay for your private school was my choice. Just like taking out loans to cover your college expenses was my choice. Just like giving you $15,000 for your wedding was my choice. Each example hit its mark, and I could see Rebecca mentally calculating the financial impact of my choices on her life. She had never thought of these contributions as sacrifices, because they had always been presented as gifts, freely given without expectation of gratitude or acknowledgement. We're grateful for everything you've done, she said, but the gratitude sounded hollow and obligatory. We just don't want you to feel like you have to keep doing things for us. I don't feel like I have to do anything, I replied, but I would like to feel appreciated for what I have done. Instead, I feel dismissed and patronized. Rebecca's frustration was becoming more apparent, as her carefully planned approach failed to achieve the desired result. Mom, you're being dramatic. We appreciate you, we love you. But we're adults now with our own lives and responsibilities. We can't be dependent on you forever. Dependent. There was the word that revealed how she really saw our relationship. In Rebecca's mind, my involvement in their lives was a form of dependence rather than love, a weakness they needed to overcome rather than a bond to be cherished. When have you been dependent on me? I asked. When have I asked either of you for anything other than basic respect and inclusion? She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again as she realized she couldn't think of a single example. I had never asked them for money, for help with household tasks, for emotional support during difficult times, or for assistance with any aspect of my life. The only thing I had wanted from them was to be treated like a valued member of their family rather than an embarrassing obligation. Look, Rebecca said, changing tactics once again. I heard you made some changes to your will. Don't you think that's a little extreme? Cutting out your own children because of one conversation? And there it was, the real reason for her visit, the same reason that had motivated Jennifer's diplomatic mission. They weren't concerned about my feelings or our relationship. They were concerned about their inheritance. The money they didn't think I had was suddenly very important to them now that they knew it existed. It wasn't one conversation, I said quietly. It was 8 years of conversations. 8 years of being excluded from family events, dismissed as irrelevant, patronized as incompetent, and treated like an inconvenience rather than your mother. Rebecca's expression hardened as she realized that her charm offensive wasn't working. So this is about revenge? You're gonna punish us financially because your feelings got hurt? The casual dismissal of my legitimate concerns as hurt feelings was exactly the kind of minimizing behavior that had brought us to this point. This is about alignment, I corrected her. My will now reflects the reality of our relationship. If I'm not needed or wanted in your lives, then you don't need or want my money either. That's not fair, she said, her voice rising with indignation. That money should go to family. Should it? I asked. Why? Because you're entitled to it? Because you've earned it through your love and respect? Because you've demonstrated that you value what I've built? The questions hung in the air unanswered, because we both knew that none of those justifications applied. Rebecca felt entitled to my money simply because she was my daughter, not because she had done anything to deserve it or because she had treated me in a way that would inspire generosity. I'm your daughter, she said finally, as if that biological fact trumped all other considerations. Yes, you are, I agreed, and I will always love you because of that. But love doesn't require me to reward behavior that I find unacceptable. Love, in fact, sometimes requires the opposite. Rebecca stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. You're making a huge mistake, Mom. When you're old and alone and need help, don't expect us to come running. We have our own lives to worry about. The threat was meant to frighten me into reconsidering my position, but it only confirmed that I had made the right decision. My daughter was essentially telling me that her love and support were conditional on my financial generosity. If I didn't include her in my will, she would abandon me in my time of need. I understand, I said calmly. And that's exactly why the money is going to people who might actually appreciate it. After Rebecca left, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and the Alaska cruise brochure, thinking about the conversations I had just endured. Both Jennifer and Rebecca had come to my home with the same objective, to manipulate me into restoring their place in my will. Neither had offered a genuine apology or acknowledged the legitimate concerns I had raised about their treatment of me. Their approach revealed everything I needed to know about how they viewed our relationship. I wasn't a person with feelings and needs of my own. I was a resource to be managed and controlled. My money wasn't a gift to be appreciated. It was an entitlement to be claimed. My love wasn't a blessing to be cherished. It was a service to be taken for granted. The realization was painful, but it was also liberating. I no longer had to pretend that our relationship was something other than what it actually was. I no longer had to accept crumbs of affection disguised as love. I no longer had to be grateful for the bare minimum of respect from my own children. That evening, I called the cruise line and booked the Alaska trip for the following month. I chose the most expensive cabin available, with a private balcony and premium amenities. After 30 years of careful spending and modest indulgences, I was finally going to treat myself to something extravagant. Friday's appointment with Sarah Morrison was productive and energizing. We spent 2 hours discussing foundation structures, tax implications, and distribution strategies. By the end of the meeting, we had outlined a plan for the Margaret Chen Foundation for Single Mothers, which would provide scholarships, job training, childcare assistance, and financial literacy programs. This is a wonderful legacy, Sarah told me as we reviewed the preliminary documents. You should be proud of what you're creating. Proud. It had been a long time since anyone had used that word in connection with my accomplishments. My children had never expressed pride in my financial acumen or my ability to build wealth from nothing. They had been embarrassed by my modest lifestyle and frustrated by my careful spending habits. But now, strangers were praising my wisdom and vision. The foundation would require ongoing management, which meant I would need to be actively involved in its operations for years to come. Instead of simply leaving money to passive recipients, I would be creating an organization that reflected my values and priorities. It would be a living testament to the importance of hard work, education, and self-reliance. Saturday brought another surprise visitor, but this one was welcome. Emma, Rebecca's 15-year-old daughter, appeared at my door with her characteristic directness and honesty. Unlike the adults in my family, Emma had always treated me with genuine affection and respect. "Hi, Grandma Margaret," she said, giving me a hug that felt completely natural and unforced. "Mom said I shouldn't come here, but I wanted to see you. Are you really going to Alaska?" Emma had always been my favorite grandchild, though I tried not to show favoritism openly. She was intelligent, curious, and refreshingly honest about her observations of the adult world around her. Unlike her parents, she seemed to see me as a complete person rather than just a grandparent who existed to fulfill a specific role. "I am going to Alaska," I confirmed, showing her the cruise brochure. "I leave in 3 weeks." She studied the pictures with genuine interest, asking questions about the itinerary and the wildlife we might see. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself sharing details about glaciers and whales that I had been researching online. "That sounds amazing," she said wistfully. "I wish I could go somewhere like that. Mom and Dad never want to do anything adventurous. They just go to the same boring resorts every year." The comment revealed something important about Emma's perspective on her parents' lifestyle. While Rebecca and Daniel saw their expensive vacations as evidence of their success, their daughter found them predictable and uninspiring. The elaborate trips that were supposed to impress others weren't creating meaningful memories for the family. Maybe when you're older you can plan your own adventures, I suggested. Travel is one of the best ways to learn about the world and yourself. Emma nodded enthusiastically, then grew more serious. Grandma, can I ask you something? Are you really mad at Mom and Uncle Daniel? Because they seem really upset about something. The question deserved an honest answer, but I wanted to be careful not to turn Emma against her parents or burden her with adult problems. I'm not angry with them, I said carefully, but I am disappointed in how they've been treating me. Sometimes when people become adults, they forget that their parents are still people with feelings and needs. She considered this explanation with the wisdom that sometimes emerges in teenagers who pay attention to the world around them. Mom has been really stressed lately, she said. She keeps talking about family obligations and responsibilities. It's like she's angry about something but won't say what it is. Family obligations and responsibilities. It sounded like Rebecca was struggling with the realization that her casual dismissal of my importance had consequences she hadn't anticipated. The money she thought she was inheriting represented more than just financial security. It represented validation of her status and worth. Sometimes adults make decisions that seem easy at the time but turn out to be more complicated than they expected, I told Emma. Your mom is probably learning that lesson right now. We spent the rest of the afternoon looking through photo albums and talking about family history. Emma was fascinated by stories of my early years as a single mother, asking detailed questions about how I had managed to work and go to school while taking care of young children. Her interest in these experiences was genuine and appreciative, a stark contrast to her parents' tendency to view my struggles as evidence of poor planning rather than resilience. You were really brave, she said after I finished telling her about working 3 jobs while studying for my CPA exam. I don't think I could handle all that pressure. You're stronger than you think, I assured her, and hopefully you'll never have to find out. But if you do face difficult challenges, remember that you have more resources than you realize. Intelligence, determination, and hard work can overcome almost any obstacle. When Emma left that evening, I felt more optimistic about the future than I had in weeks. Regardless of what happened with Rebecca and Daniel, I would always have a relationship with this remarkable young woman who appreciated my stories and valued my perspective. Perhaps some family bonds could survive the current crisis, even if others were permanently damaged. Sunday marked exactly 1 week since the conversation that had changed everything. I spent the morning in my garden, planting flowers that would bloom after I returned from Alaska. The physical work was satisfying, and the metaphor wasn't lost on me. I was literally and figuratively planting seeds for a new season of my life. My phone rang around noon, and for the first time in a week I answered when I saw Daniel's name on the caller ID. I was curious to hear his approach to reconciliation, especially after his wife's failed diplomatic mission and his sister's unsuccessful charm offensive. Mom, he said, his voice carefully controlled. I think we need to talk. Can I come over? I'm home, I replied simply, not volunteering to make the conversation easier for him. He arrived 20 minutes later, looking older and more tired than I had seen him in years. The stress of the situation was clearly taking its toll, and I wondered how much of his exhaustion was related to our family crisis versus the demands of his work and impending fatherhood. Jennifer told me about our conversation with you, he began without preamble, and Rebecca filled me in on yesterday's discussion. I wanted to talk to you directly instead of sending intermediaries. At least he acknowledged that the previous visits had been strategic rather than spontaneous. That was more honesty than I had received from either of the women who had tried to manage this situation on his behalf. I'm listening, I said, settling into my favorite chair and waiting to see what approach he would take. Daniel sat across from me, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I want to apologize for what I said last Sunday. I didn't express myself well, and I can see how my words came across as dismissive or hurtful. It was a politician's apology, acknowledging the appearance of wrongdoing without admitting actual fault. He was sorry that I had misunderstood his intentions, not sorry for the intentions themselves. "What did you mean to express?" I asked, giving him an opportunity to clarify his position. He paused, clearly struggling to find words that would satisfy me without contradicting his fundamental beliefs about our relationship. "I meant that you've done such a good job raising us that we don't need constant support anymore. That you can finally focus on your own happiness instead of always worrying about us." The explanation was essentially the same one that Jennifer and Rebecca had offered, dressed up in slightly different language. He still believed that my involvement in their lives was motivated by obligation rather than love, that my concern for their welfare was a burden I would be eager to shed. "Daniel," I said gently, "do you remember when you broke your arm in Little League? You were 9 years old, and you were so scared about the surgery to reset the bone." He nodded, confusion evident in his expression as he tried to understand the relevance of this childhood memory. "I slept in the hospital chair for 3 nights because you didn't want to be alone," I continued. "I held your hand during the procedures and helped you with everything from eating to getting dressed until your cast came off. Did I do that because I felt obligated, or because I loved you?" "Because you loved me," he said quietly. "That feeling doesn't disappear when you become an adult," I explained. "I don't take care of you because I have to anymore. I want to be involved in your life because I love you, and I'm proud of what you've accomplished. But love requires mutual respect, and respect means valuing someone's contributions rather than dismissing them." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Daniel was beginning to grasp the fundamental disconnect between his perception of our relationship and mine. He saw my continued involvement as unnecessary dependence. I saw it as natural evolution of parental love. "I do respect you," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Do you?" I asked. "Because suggesting that I need your permission to travel doesn't feel like respect. Questioning my financial decisions doesn't feel like respect. Wanting legal control over my affairs doesn't feel like respect." Each example landed like a physical blow, and I could see Daniel realizing how his behavior had been perceived. From his perspective, he had been showing concern for his aging mother's welfare. From mine, he had been treating me like an incompetent child who couldn't be trusted to manage her own life. "I was worried about you," he said weakly. "You're living alone, and you're getting older. I wanted to make sure you were protected." "Protected from what? From making my own choices? From living my own life? From having opinions that differ from yours?" I leaned forward, wanting him to really hear what I was saying. "Daniel, I've been taking care of myself for 30 years. I've built a successful career, accumulated substantial wealth, and raised 2 children who are now successful adults. What exactly makes you think I'm suddenly incapable of managing my own affairs?" The question hung in the air unanswered because we both knew the truth. His lack of confidence in my abilities wasn't based on any evidence of decline or incompetence. It was based on stereotypes about aging women and assumptions about my limitations that had no foundation in reality. "The money thing surprised us," he admitted finally. "We had no idea you were so financially successful. It changes how we think about your situation." There it was, the honest acknowledgement that their treatment of me had been based on their assumptions about my financial status. Poor Margaret needed their protection and guidance. Wealthy Margaret deserved their respect and attention. The revelation of my net worth hadn't changed who I was, but it had changed how they saw me. "Does it change how you think about me as a person?" I asked. "Because the woman you're talking to now is exactly the same woman who was sitting in that cafe last Sunday. I have the same intelligence, the same judgment, the same capacity for making sound decisions. The only thing that's different is your knowledge of my bank account." Daniel's face flushed with embarrassment as he realized the implications of what he had admitted. "That's not what I meant," he said quickly, but we both knew it was exactly what he meant. "I think it is what you meant," I said calmly, "and I think it reveals something important about how you and Rebecca have been viewing me for years. You've been seeing me as a poor, aging woman who needed your protection, rather than as a competent adult who deserved your respect." The conversation continued for another hour, with Daniel making various attempts to justify his behavior and minimize the impact of his words. But the fundamental issue remained unchanged. He couldn't understand why I found his treatment unacceptable, and I couldn't accept being treated like an incompetent burden by my own son. When he left that evening, I felt a profound sadness that had nothing to do with money or wills or inheritance. I was mourning the loss of the relationship I thought we had, the love I thought was unconditional, the respect I thought I had earned through 30 years of devoted motherhood. But I was also experiencing something else, a growing sense of excitement about the life I was creating for myself. The Alaska cruise was just the beginning. I had decades of adventures ahead of me, relationships to build with people who valued my company, and meaningful work to do through the foundation I was establishing. For the first time in my adult life, I was free to be Margaret Chen, not just somebody's mother or somebody's caregiver or somebody's problem to be managed. And that freedom, I was discovering, was worth every penny I wouldn't be leaving to my children. The morning of my departure for Alaska dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn sunshine that made everything look sharp and full of possibility. I stood at my bedroom window watching the neighborhood wake up and felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. My suitcases were packed with clothes I had actually enjoyed choosing, my passport was tucked safely in my purse, and my phone was deliberately turned off. Today belonged entirely to me. The taxi arrived precisely at 9, driven by a cheerful man named Roberto, who helped me load my luggage with genuine care. As we pulled away from my duplex, I didn't look back. That chapter of my life was closing, and I was eager to see what the next one would bring. The foundation paperwork was complete, my affairs were in order, and I had 3 months of adventure ahead of me. Because somewhere between booking the Alaska cruise and finalizing the foundation documents, I had decided that one trip wasn't nearly enough. After Alaska, I would spend 6 weeks in New Zealand, followed by a month-long cultural tour of Japan. For the first time in my adult life, I had both the money and the freedom to do exactly what I wanted when I wanted to do it. The Seattle departure terminal was bustling with excited travelers, most of them couples or families, preparing for what many described as a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I checked in at the solo traveler counter, collected my cabin key, and boarded the ship with the confidence of someone who had finally learned to enjoy her own company. My stateroom was everything the brochure had promised and more. The private balcony offered stunning views of Puget Sound, and the carefully appointed interior felt like a luxury hotel suite. I unpacked slowly, savoring each moment of the ritual, hanging up the new clothes I had bought specifically for this adventure. The first evening aboard was magical in ways I hadn't anticipated. The dining room was elegant without being intimidating, and my assigned table included 3 other solo travelers who quickly became fast friends. There was Patricia, a retired teacher from Oregon who had always wanted to see glaciers, Michael, a widower from Colorado who was taking his first vacation in 5 years, and Sandra, a recently divorced woman from California who was celebrating her newfound independence. We talked for hours that first night, sharing stories of the paths that had led us to this moment. I found myself opening up about my children's dismissal and my decision to change my will, topics I hadn't expected to discuss with strangers. But these weren't really strangers anymore. They were fellow travelers who understood the courage it took to claim your own life, after decades of living for others. "Good for you," Patricia said when I finished explaining how I had ended up on the cruise. "I spent 40 years putting everyone else's needs first. My husband, my children, my students, my aging parents. When I finally retired, I realized I had no idea what I actually wanted for myself." Michael nodded in understanding. "After my wife died, my kids kept trying to manage my grief timeline. They wanted me to sell the house, move closer to them, start dating again, all according to their schedule. Finally, I told them I needed to figure out my own next chapter." Sandra raised her wine glass in a toast. "To figuring out our own next chapters," she said with a grin. "And to having the resources to write them however we want." The week that followed was a revelation. I discovered that I loved whale watching from the ship's deck, that I could handle the hiking excursions better than people half my age, and that I had a talent for photography that I had never explored. Each day brought new experiences and new confidence in my ability to navigate the world independently. More importantly, I found myself forming genuine friendships with people who appreciated my company for its own sake. Patricia and I spent hours on deck chairs, talking about books and travel plans and life philosophy. Michael taught me to play bridge, and Sandra and I signed up for a cooking class together. These people knew nothing about my net worth or my family situation. They simply enjoyed spending time with Margaret Chen, the interesting woman who had stories to tell and opinions worth hearing. The ship's library became one of my favorite refuges. It was quiet and comfortable, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered spectacular views of the coastline. I spent several afternoons there, reading about the history of the regions we were visiting and writing in the journal I had started keeping. On the fourth day, I wrote an entry that surprised me with its clarity. I realize now that I've been living my entire adult life as a supporting character in other people's stories. I was David's wife, then Rebecca and Daniel's mother, then their children's grandmother, but I was never just Margaret, a woman with her own dreams and ambitions and right to happiness. This trip isn't just a vacation, it's my debut as the Damas, protagonist of my own life. The phone calls started on day 5. My cell phone had been turned off since I boarded, but I had given the ship's contact information to Sarah Morrison in case of emergencies. The purser delivered a message that my daughter had called the cruise line's emergency number, claiming there was a family crisis that required my immediate contact. I knew there was no real emergency. Rebecca was simply panicking as she realized that I was serious about the changes I had made to my life. The message said she needed to reach me urgently about important family matters, but I suspected the only urgent matter was her growing anxiety about the inheritance she was losing. I called the ship's communications center and left a message for Rebecca through the cruise line's relay service. I am safe and well and enjoying my vacation. If there is a genuine emergency requiring my immediate return, please contact my attorney Sarah Morrison. Otherwise, I will speak with you when I return from my travels in 3 months. The message was deliberately businesslike and final. I wasn't going to allow family drama to intrude on this experience, and I wanted to make it clear that my travel plans were not negotiable. The glaciers of Glacier Bay were more spectacular than any photograph could capture. Standing on the deck as chunks of ice the size of buildings calved off into the ocean, I felt connected to something larger and more enduring than family squabbles or inheritance disputes. The natural world operated according to its own timeline, indifferent to human attempts to control or manipulate outcomes. I thought about my children as I watched the ancient ice formations, wondering if they would ever understand that love couldn't be bought or sold, controlled or manipulated. The money they wanted so desperately was just numbers in an account. The relationship they were losing was irreplaceable. On our last night aboard the ship, Patricia, Michael, Sandra, and I exchanged contact information and made plans to meet again. Patricia was planning a trip to Egypt in the spring and invited me to join her. Michael mentioned a photography workshop in Ireland that he thought I would enjoy. Sandra was considering a river cruise through Eastern Europe and wanted travel companions. For the first time in years, I had a social calendar that revolved around my own interests, rather than family obligations. These friendships were based on mutual respect and shared enthusiasms, not biological connections or historical dependencies. They saw me as an interesting, capable woman worth knowing, not as a resource to be managed or a problem to be solved. The flight from Seattle to San Francisco, where I would catch my connection to Auckland, gave me time to reflect on the week that had just passed. I had proven to myself that I could travel independently, make new friends, and enjoy experiences that had nothing to do with my role as a mother or grandmother. The woman who had been afraid to take a simple cruise had navigated airports, excursions, and social situations with confidence and grace. New Zealand exceeded every expectation I had harbored. The landscapes were breathtaking, the people were welcoming, and the pace of life allowed for the kind of deep appreciation that rushed tourism never permits. I rented a car and drove through both islands, staying in small bed and breakfasts where the owners treated guests like family friends rather than anonymous customers. In Queenstown, I met an adventure tour guide named Helen, who was about my age and had started her outdoor business after her own children had grown and moved away. She had been married to a man who expected her to be satisfied with domestic life, but after their divorce, she had discovered a passion for mountain climbing and wilderness photography. The best part about starting over in your 50s, Helen told me as we hiked through Milford Sound, is that you finally know who you are. You're not trying to please everyone else or live up to other people's expectations. You can just be yourself. Her words resonated deeply with me. I was indeed discovering who Margaret Chen was when she wasn't trying to earn love through service or prove her worth through sacrifice. I was funnier than I had realized, more adventurous than I had ever allowed myself to be, and far more interesting than my family had given me credit for. The weeks in New Zealand passed quickly, filled with hiking, sightseeing, and conversations with fellow travelers from around the world. I sent postcards to Emma and to Sarah Morrison, but I didn't attempt to contact Rebecca or Daniel. They had made it clear that my presence in their lives was unnecessary. I was simply taking them at their word. Japan was a completely different experience, one that challenged me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The language barrier was significant, but I discovered that genuine kindness translates across all cultural boundaries. Elderly Japanese women took me under their wing in markets and temples, showing me how to bow properly and which foods to try. Young people helped me navigate the subway system and find my way to museums and gardens. The cultural tour I had booked was led by a professor named Dr. Yamamoto, who spoke eloquent English and had spent years studying American attitudes toward aging and family relationships. During one of our group discussions, he made an observation that stopped me in my tracks. In Japan, we have a concept called ikigai, which roughly translates to reason for being, he explained to our small group of American tourists. Many Western visitors struggle with this concept because they have defined their purpose entirely through their relationships to others. But ikigai is about finding meaning in your own existence, independent of your roles as spouse, parent, or child. That evening, I sat in my hotel room in Kyoto, looking out at a perfectly maintained garden, and tried to articulate my own ikigai. For 30 years, my reason for being had been to ensure my children's success and happiness. But what was my purpose now that they had declared independence from my care and concern? The answer came to me gradually over the following days as I visited temples and participated in tea ceremonies and learned about Japanese art. My ikigai was to help other women avoid the trap I had fallen into, defining themselves entirely through service to others while neglecting their own growth and dreams. The foundation I was establishing wouldn't just provide financial assistance to single mothers. It would also offer workshops on self-advocacy, financial independence, and personal development. I wanted to help women understand that loving their children didn't require sacrificing their own identity, that being a good mother included modeling self-respect and personal fulfillment. By the time I boarded the plane in Tokyo for the long flight home, I had filled 3 journals with thoughts, observations, and plans. The woman who had left Seattle 6 weeks earlier had been running away from family disappointment. The woman returning was running toward a new purpose and a life of her own design. The transformation was so complete that I almost didn't recognize myself in the airport bathroom mirror. I looked tanned and relaxed, confident in a way that went deeper than surface appearance. Travel had been transformative, but more importantly, the time away from family expectations had allowed me to rediscover my own strength and worth. I had deliberately not told anyone my exact return date, wanting to ease back into my regular life without the pressure of immediate family confrontations. But as my taxi pulled into my driveway on a crisp December afternoon, I saw Rebecca's car parked on the street and Daniel's SUV in my neighbor's driveway. They had been watching for my return, probably taking shifts to make sure they didn't miss me. The thought of being surveilled in my own neighborhood was both irritating and somehow validating. If they were going to such lengths to catch me, then my absence had clearly had the impact I intended. I paid the taxi driver and retrieved my luggage, taking my time and enjoying the feeling of being home after months of living out of suitcases. Rebecca appeared from her car almost immediately, looking thinner and more stressed than I had ever seen her. Daniel emerged from his vehicle a moment later, his face showing the strain of whatever the past 3 months had brought. "Mom," Rebecca said, approaching cautiously as if I might flee at any moment. "We need to talk." "Hello, Rebecca." "Hello, Daniel," I replied pleasantly, pulling my suitcase toward the front door. "I hope you're both well." The neutral greeting seemed to throw them off balance. They had probably prepared for anger or coldness, but I felt neither. The months of travel and self-discovery had given me a perspective that made family drama seem distant and manageable. "Can we come in?" Daniel asked, gesturing toward the house. "We've been waiting for you to come home so we could discuss this situation." this situation. Even now, they couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge what they had done or take responsibility for the consequences of their actions. It was still just a situation that needed to be managed rather than a relationship that needed to be repaired. "Of course," I said, unlocking my front door. "Though I should mention that I'm quite tired from traveling and won't be able to visit for long." The statement established boundaries from the moment we entered the house. This would be a conversation on my terms, according to my schedule, with my comfort and well-being taking priority. After years of accommodating their needs and preferences, I was finally putting myself first. My living room looked exactly as I had left it, but somehow smaller and more modest than I remembered. The months of staying in hotels and guest houses around the world had recalibrated my sense of space and luxury. This was still home, but it was no longer the full extent of my world. Rebecca and Daniel sat on my sofa like supplicants in a throne room, clearly uncomfortable and uncertain how to begin. I settled into my favorite chair and waited for them to speak first. The silence stretched until Rebecca finally broke it with typical directness. "Mom, we made a mistake," she said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "We said things we didn't mean, and we handled the situation badly. We want to make it right." Make it right. The phrase suggested that their concern was about fixing a problem rather than understanding how their behavior had affected me. They wanted to return to the previous status quo, not create a healthier dynamic going forward. "What mistake did you make?" I asked calmly. The question forced them to be specific, rather than hiding behind vague apologies. Rebecca looked to Daniel for support, but he seemed equally uncertain about how to proceed. "We shouldn't have said you weren't needed anymore," Daniel said finally. "We shouldn't have made you feel unwanted or unappreciated. Shouldn't have made me feel." Even in his apology, he was focusing on my reaction, rather than their actions. The problem in his mind was that I had misinterpreted their words, rather than that their words had been hurtful and dismissive. "How did you expect me to feel when you told me you didn't need me anymore?" I asked. The question hung in the air unanswered because they hadn't thought about my feelings at all. They had been focused on establishing their independence and managing what they saw as my excessive involvement in their lives. My emotional response had never been a consideration. "We thought you'd be relieved," Rebecca said quietly. "We thought you'd be happy to have less responsibility." The admission revealed the fundamental disconnect between their perception and reality. They had convinced themselves that my involvement in their lives was a burden I would be eager to shed rather than an expression of love I valued and enjoyed. "Did you ever ask me how I felt about my role in your lives?" I inquired. "Did you ever consider that I might choose to be involved because I love you, not because I feel obligated?" More silence. Of course they had never asked, because they had never considered that I might have preferences or feelings about our relationship that differed from their assumptions. "We're asking now," Daniel said, though his tone suggested the question was more strategic than genuine. "How do you feel about your role in our lives?" I considered the question carefully, thinking about all the conversations and revelations of the past 3 months. "I feel like I've been taken for granted," I said finally. "I feel like my contributions have been minimized, and my judgment has been questioned. I feel like you've seen me as an obligation rather than a blessing." The words were honest but not angry. I had moved beyond anger during my travels, reaching a place of clarity that allowed me to speak truth without emotional charge. "That's not how we see you," Rebecca protested, but her words lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I asked. "Because questioning my ability to take a cruise suggests you think I have poor judgment. Wanting legal control over my finances suggests you think I'm incompetent. Telling me I'm not needed anymore suggests you think I'm a burden rather than a welcome presence." Each point landed with visible impact, and I could see them realizing how their individual actions had created a cumulative picture of disrespect and dismissal. "We were worried about you," Daniel said, falling back on the excuse he had used months earlier. "Were you worried about me, or were you worried about how my behavior might reflect on you?" I asked. "Because there's a significant difference between concern for my welfare and concern for your image." The distinction was one they had never considered, but I could see them processing the implications. Their worry hadn't been about my safety or happiness. It had been about maintaining control over how I lived my life, and how that life affected their comfort and convenience. "What do you want from us?" Rebecca asked, abandoning the pretense of apology and moving directly to negotiation. "What would it take to fix this?" The question revealed that she still didn't understand the fundamental issue. She thought this was about demands that could be met or conditions that could be satisfied, not about respect that needed to be genuine and ongoing. "I want you to see me as a complete person," I said simply. "Not just as your mother, but as Margaret Chen, a woman who has her own thoughts, feelings, dreams, and right to make decisions about her own life." "We do see you that way," Daniel insisted, but his protest sounded hollow even to him. "Do you?" I challenged. "Because when I mentioned wanting to travel, you questioned whether I could afford it. When I made financial decisions, you suggested I needed professional guidance. When I offered to help with childcare, you implied that my experience was inadequate." The examples created a pattern they could no longer deny or rationalize away. Their treatment of me had been consistently patronizing and dismissive, regardless of their stated intentions. "We can change," Rebecca said desperately. "We can treat you better. We can include you more. We can respect your decisions." Can and will are very different words, and I noticed she had chosen the one that implied possibility rather than commitment. After months of reflection and growth, I was no longer willing to accept vague promises of improvement. "I appreciate that," I said, "but I'm no longer interested in earning respect from my own children. Either you value who I am and what I bring to your lives, or you don't. Either way, I'm going to continue living my life according to my own values and priorities." The statement was a declaration of independence that left no room for negotiation or compromise. I was no longer willing to modify my behavior to accommodate their comfort or convenience. "What about your will?" Daniel asked, finally addressing the issue that had probably motivated this entire conversation. "Are you going to change it back?" The directness of the question was almost refreshing after months of diplomatic dancing around the topic. At least now we were discussing their real concern openly. "My will reflects my current relationships and priorities," I said calmly. "If those relationships and priorities change, then perhaps the will might change as well." It wasn't a promise or a threat, just a statement of fact. They were welcome to work toward rebuilding our relationship, but that work would need to be genuine and sustained, not just a temporary effort to restore their inheritance. "That's not fair," Rebecca said, her composure finally cracking. "You're holding our inheritance hostage to force us to behave the way you want." The accusation revealed how she truly saw the situation. In her mind, the money was already hers, and I was using it as leverage to manipulate her behavior. She couldn't understand that the money was mine to dispose of as I saw fit, based on my own values and judgments. "The money was never yours," I said gently. "It was always mine to give or not give, based on my assessment of who would value and appreciate it. You've demonstrated that you don't value my judgment or appreciate my contributions to your lives. Why would I reward that behavior?" The question silenced them both because they couldn't argue with the logic, without admitting that they felt entitled to money they hadn't earned from a woman they didn't respect. "You're our mother," Daniel said finally, falling back on the biological argument that had failed him months earlier. "Yes, I am," I agreed. "And I will always love you because of that. But being your mother doesn't obligate me to accept poor treatment or reward behavior that I find unacceptable." The conversation continued for another hour, with Rebecca and Daniel making various attempts to negotiate, apologize, and promise improvement. But the fundamental dynamic remained unchanged. They wanted to restore their inheritance without genuinely examining or changing their attitudes toward me. When they finally left that evening, I felt neither satisfaction nor sadness. The months of travel and reflection had given me a perspective that made their desperation seem both understandable and irrelevant. They were focused on recovering what they thought they had lost, while I was focused on building what I had gained. The foundation was thriving under Sarah Morrison's management, and the first scholarships would be awarded in the spring. I had applications from dozens of single mothers who wanted help with education, job training, and childcare expenses. Their gratitude and determination reminded me daily of why I had chosen to redirect my legacy. Emma called me the day after my return, full of questions about my travels and genuine excitement about my adventures. She was the one family member who had never made me feel like a burden or an obligation, and our relationship remained as strong as ever. "Grandma Margaret," she said during one of our phone conversations, "I'm really proud of what you did. Standing up for yourself and doing what you wanted instead of what everyone expected. I hope I'm as brave as you when I'm older." Her words meant more to me than any inheritance could have meant to her parents. Emma saw my choices as brave rather than selfish, inspiring rather than disappointing. She understood what Rebecca and Daniel couldn't, that self-respect and personal fulfillment aren't luxuries to be postponed indefinitely, but necessities that make all other relationships healthier and more authentic. Spring brought new developments in both my personal life and my foundation work. Patricia and I took the Egypt trip we had planned, and Michael joined us for the final week. Sandra started dating someone new and invited me to be her maid of honor when she got engaged 6 months later. My travel friends had become my chosen family, people who appreciated my company for its own sake. The Foundation's first scholarship recipients were remarkable women, whose stories reminded me of my own younger self. There was Maria, a mother of 3, who was studying nursing while working nights at a convenience store. There was Lisa, a divorced woman learning computer programming to support her teenage daughters. There was Jennifer, a young mother, who had escaped an abusive relationship and was rebuilding her life from nothing. Each of these women understood the value of help when it was offered, and each expressed gratitude that went far beyond polite acknowledgement. They saw the scholarships not as entitlements but as opportunities, and they used them to build better lives for themselves and their children. Rebecca and Daniel made sporadic attempts to reconnect throughout the year, but their efforts felt calculated rather than genuine. They remembered my birthday and sent flowers. They invited me to holiday meals where they were conspicuously polite and attentive. Daniel and Jennifer named me as the baby's emergency contact, presumably hoping to demonstrate that they valued my involvement. But underlying these gestures was the same fundamental lack of respect that had created our rift in the first place. They were performing the role of loving children, rather than genuinely examining their attitudes or behavior. They wanted to restore the benefits of our relationship without accepting the responsibilities that should accompany it. The second year after my cruise brought even more dramatic changes. I sold my duplex and bought a small house in a retirement community that offered a perfect balance of independence and social connection. My neighbors were active, interesting people who had also chosen to prioritize their own happiness in their later years. I started teaching financial literacy workshops for single mothers through the Foundation, sharing the knowledge I had accumulated over decades of careful investing and planning. These women hung on every word, asked thoughtful questions, and implemented my suggestions with the kind of determination that comes from understanding how much financial independence can change your life. The work was more fulfilling than anything I had ever done, including motherhood. These women chose to learn from me, chose to value my expertise, chose to see me as a mentor worth respecting. The relationship was reciprocal in ways that my family relationships had never been. Emma graduated from high school that spring and was accepted to several excellent colleges. When she asked if I would contribute to her education expenses, I was happy to help, not through my will but through a direct gift that allowed me to see the immediate impact of my generosity. "Thank you, Grandma Margaret," she said when I handed her the check. "I know things have been weird with Mom and Uncle Daniel, but I want you to know that I've always appreciated everything you've done for our family." Her maturity and gratitude stood in stark contrast to her parents' sense of entitlement and their inability to acknowledge my contributions. At 18, Emma understood concepts of respect and appreciation that her mother and uncle had never grasped. The third year brought news that Daniel and Jennifer were expecting their second child. They extended a tentative invitation for me to be involved in the new baby's life, but their approach was still conditional and controlling. They wanted me to follow their rules, accept their limitations, and be grateful for whatever access they chose to grant. I declined their conditional offer and instead focused on the relationships that brought me joy and fulfillment. My travel friends and I were planning a group trip to South America. My foundation work was expanding to include financial literacy programs in high schools. My own life was fuller and more satisfying than it had ever been. Rebecca's marriage ended in divorce that fall, and she reached out to me with what seemed like genuine vulnerability for the first time in years. Her husband had left her for a younger woman, and she was facing the same challenges I had confronted 30 years earlier: single motherhood, financial uncertainty, and the need to rebuild her life from scratch. "Mom," she said during a tearful phone call, "I think I'm finally beginning to understand what you went through when Dad died. I don't know how you managed to hold everything together." For a moment, I thought we might finally bridge the gap that had separated us for so long. But when I offered concrete help, suggesting that she might benefit from the Foundation's job training programs and financial literacy workshops, she bristled at the implication that she needed assistance from charity cases. Even in her moment of greatest need, Rebecca couldn't accept help that came without strings attached, or acknowledge that she might have something to learn from women whose circumstances resembled her own. Her pride and sense of superiority remained intact, even as her world crumbled around her. I sent her a check to help with immediate expenses, but I didn't try to force a reconciliation or pretend that one difficult conversation had healed years of mutual disappointment. Change requires sustained effort and genuine humility, qualities that Rebecca had not yet developed. By the 4th year, I had established a routine that revolved around my own interests and priorities. I traveled several months each year, worked with the Foundation, maintained my house and garden, and enjoyed the company of friends who shared my values and interests. It was a life I had designed for myself, rather than one that had been imposed by others. Expectations. Emma graduated from college with honors and immediately began working for a nonprofit organization that provided services to low-income families. She had chosen a career path that reflected genuine concern for others' welfare, and she approached her work with the kind of passion and dedication that I recognized from my own younger years. "I want to make a difference," she told me during one of our regular phone conversations. "I want to help people the way your foundation helps people. I want to use my education and privilege to lift others up rather than just advancing my own interests." Her words filled me with pride and hope. At least one member of the next generation understood the importance of service and the satisfaction that comes from helping others achieve their potential. Daniel and Jennifer's marriage survived his infidelity scandal the following year, but their relationship with me remained distant and transactional. They sent obligatory cards on holidays and invited me to major family events, but there was no genuine warmth or connection in our interactions. Rebecca eventually remarried, this time to a man who appreciated her intelligence and ambition. Her new husband seemed kind and supportive, and I hoped that a healthier relationship might help her develop the empathy and humility she had always lacked. But even this positive change didn't fundamentally alter how she saw our relationship. She wanted to reconcile, but only on her terms. Only if I agreed to pretend that the past didn't matter and that her behavior hadn't caused lasting damage. The 5th anniversary of my Alaska cruise arrived with little fanfare. I marked the occasion by booking another trip, this time to Antarctica, the one continent I hadn't yet visited. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I was still exploring new territories, still discovering new aspects of myself, still refusing to be limited by others' expectations or assumptions. The Foundation had grown into a significant organization that provided assistance to hundreds of single mothers each year. We had expanded our services to include childcare support, job placement assistance, and small business loans. The women we helped often became advocates and volunteers themselves, creating a community of mutual support that extended far beyond financial assistance. Sarah Morrison had become one of my closest friends, and she often marveled at the transformation she had witnessed in my life. "When you first came to me about changing your will," she said during one of our monthly lunches, "I thought you were making an emotional decision that you might later regret. But watching you build this foundation and create this new life for yourself, I realize it was the most rational thing you could have done." Her observation reminded me of how far I had come from the woman who had sat in that cafe 5 years earlier, stunned by her children's casual dismissal of her value. That woman had been seeking validation and appreciation from people who were incapable of providing it. The woman I had become no longer needed their approval to know her own worth. Rebecca and Daniel made one final attempt at reconciliation during the Foundation's 5th anniversary celebration. They attended the gala dinner where I was being honored for my charitable work, and they approached me afterward with what seemed like genuine admiration for what I had accomplished. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice carrying a note of respect I hadn't heard in years, "what you've built here is incredible. I had no idea you were capable of something this significant." The compliment was revealing in its backhanded nature. He was impressed by my accomplishments but surprised that I was capable of them. Even in praise, he was diminishing me by suggesting that my success was unexpected rather than the natural result of abilities and talents they had never bothered to recognize. "Thank you," I replied graciously, accepting the compliment while ignoring its implied limitations. Rebecca was more direct in her approach. "I've been thinking a lot about our relationship over the past few years," she said. "I think I finally understand what you were trying to tell us about respect and appreciation. I'd like to try again if you're willing." The offer was tempting, but I had learned to look beyond words to actions, beyond intentions to results. "I'm always willing to build positive relationships with people who genuinely value what I bring to their lives," I said carefully. "But that kind of relationship requires sustained effort and consistent respect, not just good intentions." The qualifier was important because it established expectations without making promises. I was open to reconciliation, but only if they were willing to do the ongoing work required to earn and maintain my trust. The conversation that followed was different from all our previous discussions. Rebecca and Daniel seemed to finally understand that their inheritance wasn't an entitlement but a privilege that could be earned through genuine relationship. They asked thoughtful questions about my foundation work and listened to my answers without trying to manage or redirect the conversation. For the first time in years, I felt like they were seeing me as a complete person, rather than just their mother. It was a promising start, but I knew that real change would require time and consistency. Over the following months, both Rebecca and Daniel made genuine efforts to rebuild our relationship. They called regularly without agenda, included me in family activities without conditions, and asked for my advice while respecting my right to decline involvement. Rebecca volunteered at the foundation, using her marketing skills to help promote our programs and attract new donors. Daniel used his technical expertise to improve our website and database systems. Both of them began to understand the scope and impact of the work I was doing. Emma graduated from law school and immediately began working for a firm that specialized in family law and custody issues. Her chosen specialty allowed her to help other women navigate the legal challenges that often accompany single motherhood and relationship dissolution. "I want to be the kind of lawyer who actually helps people instead of just making money," she told me. "I want to follow your example of using whatever skills and resources I have to make other people's lives better." Her career choice and her motivation filled me with immense pride. Emma had grown into the kind of woman I had always hoped my own daughter might become: thoughtful, compassionate, and committed to service, rather than just personal advancement. As the 7th year after my life-changing cruise approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who had once defined herself entirely through her relationships to others had discovered that she was interesting, capable, and valuable in her own right. The foundation I had established was thriving, the friendships I had built were deep and genuine, and the life I had created was fulfilling in ways I had never imagined possible. I had proven to myself that it was never too late to start over, never too late to claim your own happiness, never too late to demand the respect you deserve. Rebecca and Daniel had gradually earned their way back into my life through consistent effort and genuine respect. They still made mistakes sometimes, still occasionally fell back into old patterns of thinking about me as their aging mother rather than as Margaret Chen, accomplished woman. But they caught themselves more quickly now, and they were learning to see me as a complete person with my own thoughts, feelings, and right to make decisions about my own life. The will I had rewritten in anger 7 years earlier remained unchanged, but for different reasons now. The foundation was doing important work that I wanted to continue long after my death. The women it helped understood the value of assistance and used it to build better lives for themselves and their children. But I had also established smaller trust funds for Rebecca, Daniel, and Emma, enough to provide security without creating dependence. These bequests would be revealed only after my death, a final gift that acknowledged our family bonds, while honoring the principles I had fought to establish. Emma would receive the largest individual bequest, along with a personal letter explaining how proud I was of the woman she had become and the choices she had made. Rebecca and Daniel would receive smaller amounts, with letters expressing my love for them while also documenting the lessons I hoped they had learned from our years of estrangement and reconciliation. The primary lesson, the one I hoped they would carry forward and pass on to their own children, was simple but profound. Love without respect is manipulation, and respect cannot be demanded or bought, only earned through consistent behavior over time. Standing in my garden on a crisp morning 7 years later, I watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The flowers I had planted were blooming magnificently, their colors vibrant against the rich soil I had carefully tended. Like those flowers, I had flourished once given the proper conditions: respect, appreciation, and the freedom to grow according to my own nature. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia about our upcoming trip to Morocco, and I smiled as I headed inside to make coffee and plan another adventure. Some gardens bloom late, but they bloom beautifully. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.